Louis Hartwell's rifle was already raised before he even recognized the shape of her against the dying afternoon sky. She sat on the flat granite outcropping at the far eastern edge of his claim, her back straight, her pale blue skirt pooled around her like spilled water, and she was looking out over the valley below as if she owned every inch of it. He had seen claim jumpers before, men who came creeping in the dark with their greedy hands and their forged papers, but he had never in his 31 years of living seen one who sat so openly in the last golden light of a September afternoon, as if they were simply waiting for someone to bring them tea. His jaw tightened. His finger rested against the guard but did not touch the trigger. Not yet. He crossed the 50 yards between them in hard, deliberate strides, his boots cracking against loose shale, his shadow falling long and dark across the rock face, and still she did not turn around. Either she had nerves of cold iron or she had not heard him, and Louis Hartwell had been told more than once that he was not a quiet man. He stopped 10 feet behind her. "This is private property," he said. His voice came out lower than he intended, rough-edged with suspicion and something else he could not name. "You are sitting on my claim." She turned then. And the look on her face was not the look of a thief caught in the act. It was not cunning, not calculating, not the particular brand of practiced innocence he had learned to see through over years of hard living. It was simply shock, wide-eyed and genuine, a flush of color riding up into her cheeks beneath a fine layer of trail dust, and she pressed one hand flat against the rock as if to steady herself. "Your claim," she said, not a question. A realization arriving in real time, settling over her features like the shadow of a passing cloud. "I had not known it was yours." 5 words. Simple, plain, and yet they cracked something open in him that he had spent the better part of 3 years sealing shut. He did not lower the rifle immediately. Trust was a currency he had run out of, and the woman sitting on his granite rock was a stranger with a story he did not yet know. And in 1878 in the Colorado Territory, a stranger with a story could mean the end of everything a man had built. But her eyes held steady on his, dark brown and direct, and she did not flinch from the barrel of his rifle, which told him something about who she was even before she spoke another word. "My name is Bessie Fairchild," she said, in a voice that carried the careful diction of someone who had been raised to speak precisely. "I arrived in Glenwood 2 days ago. I was told the northern trail through these foothills was open to travel." Louis kept his eyes on her face. "Who told you that?" she blinked. "A man at the land office. A Mr. Colton, I believe." The name landed in his chest like a thrown stone hitting still water, and the ripples spread out fast and cold. Randall Colton. Of course it was Randall Colton. Louis finally lowered the rifle, but the tension did not leave his shoulders, and the suspicion did not leave his eyes. He studied the woman on the rock with the particular attention of a man who has learned, through the specific cruelty of betrayal, that nothing in this life arrives without a hidden motive attached to it. She was perhaps 26 or 27, he guessed, with the kind of face that was honest about what it was thinking even when the person behind it was trying to be composed. Her dark hair had come partly undone from whatever arrangement she had made of it that morning, and she had a canvas bag beside her on the rock and a pair of boots that had clearly not been purchased for walking mountain terrain. She was not a prospector. She was not a claim jumper. She was something considerably more complicated, Louis Hartwell suspected, than either of those things. "How long ago did you leave Glenwood?" he asked. "This morning," she said. "I have been walking since shortly after dawn." He looked past her down into the valley where the sun was dropping fast behind the western ridgeline. The temperature would fall 20 degrees in the next hour. The nearest shelter besides his own cabin was 4 miles south, and the trail down to the main road was treacherous in full dark. He looked back at her. He already knew what he was going to do, and he already knew it was going to cost him something he could not yet calculate. "Come on then," he said, and turned back toward the cabin without waiting to see if she would follow. 3 years before any of this, Louis Hartwell had been a different kind of man. He had come to the Colorado Territory in the spring of 1875 with $200, a mule, a set of prospecting tools, and a partner he had trusted with the kind of absolute faith that only very young men or very foolish men extend to another person without proof. His name was Daniel Reese, and they had grown up together in Ohio, and Louis had believed, with the certainty of long familiarity, that there was no man alive who knew him better or wished him better than Daniel did. He had been wrong about that in the particular way that makes a man careful for the rest of his days. They had staked their claim together on the eastern slope above the roaring Fork River Valley, and it had taken them 8 months of backbreaking work before they found the first real color in the quartz, a seam of gold-bearing ore that ran deep and consistent through the gray rock. It was not the mother lode that miners dreamed of, but it was honest and reliable and worth real money over real time, and Louis had felt, standing in that narrow shaft with lamplight throwing orange shadows over the walls, that he had finally done it. He had built something that could not be taken from him. And then Daniel had disappeared on a Tuesday in November, taking with him the deed copy, the assessor's report, and every dollar they had saved from the first season's work, and the name of the land office man he had been corresponding with in private turned out to be Randall Colton. The legal fight had taken the better part of a year, and every cent Louis could borrow. He had won, ultimately, because he had the original survey stakes and the testimony of 2 neighboring claims who had watched him work the land from the beginning. But winning had left him with a claim he could barely maintain, a debt he was still paying down, and a dark certainty about the nature of men that had calcified around his heart like mineral deposits around an ore seam. He had not let anyone close since, not all the way close, not the kind of close that gave a person access to the things that mattered. And now there was Bessie Fairchild sitting at his table, warming her hands on the tin cup of coffee he had made without quite deciding to, and watching him with those steady dark eyes, while he tried to determine what exactly Randall Colton had sent her here to find. "You said you arrived in Glenwood 2 days ago," Louis said, settling himself into the chair across from her and keeping the table between them like a negotiating distance. "Where did you come from before that?" "St. Louis," she said. "By rail to Denver, then by stagecoach to Glenwood. That is a long way to travel alone." Something moved across her face. Not evasion exactly, but the careful management of a subject that had weight in it. "I'm not the first woman to make that journey alone," she said. "And I suspect I will not be the last." Louis leaned back in his chair and looked at her steadily. "What is your business in this part of the territory, Miss Fairchild?" "I am a school teacher," she said, and the simplicity of it seemed to cost her something, though he could not understand why. "I have been hired to teach at the new school in Glenwood for the coming term. I arrived early to find lodgings and to familiarize myself with the area before the children came." He turned that over. It had the texture of the truth. It had the particular shape of a life that was practical and purposeful and moving forward. And yet, "And the land office," he said carefully. "Why did you go there?" Bessie set her cup down. She folded her hands on the table with a deliberateness that told him she understood the weight of his question even if she did not fully understand its source. "I was inquiring about land," she said, "whether there was any affordable property available near the town. I had some small savings and I thought." She paused. "I thought that owning a small piece of land might give me a kind of stability that renting cannot." Louis stared at her. "Colton sent you up the northern trail specifically. He said it was the most scenic route, and that I might enjoy the view of the valley from the high ground." She met his eyes. "I can see now that that was not his actual reason." The directness of it caught him off guard. He had been bracing for deflection, for the particular dance of misdirection that people performed when they had something to hide. But she was looking at him with that clear, unsettling gaze, and telling him plainly that she understood she had been used, even if she did not yet know exactly how or why. "Randall Colton has been trying to acquire this claim for 2 years, Louis said. His voice came out flat and controlled. the way it always did when he spoke about things that still had the capacity to make him furious. He works with a group of investors out of Denver who buy up small claims once the original owner has been pushed out or frightened off. He has used various methods. Bessie was very still, and you believed I might be one of his methods. I considered it. And now, Louis looked at her for a long moment. The lamplight moved in the draft from the stovepipe, throwing warmth and shadow alternately across her face, and he could see clearly that she was tired from the day's walking and steady in spite of it, and that whatever complicated feelings were moving behind those dark eyes of hers had nothing to do with Randall Colton's schemes. "Now," he said slowly, "I think you were told a trail was open that was not open and sent up here either to test whether I would drive a woman off at gunpoint, which I think Colton hoped might create some legal complication for me, or simply because the man enjoys causing trouble for its own sake." Bessie was quiet for a moment, processing this with a visible, focused attention that he found unexpectedly striking in its quality. She was not fluttered. She was thinking. "He mentioned your claim," she said. "When I asked about land in the northern hills, he said something dismissive about a difficult man who was sitting on a perfectly good piece of ground out of pure stubbornness." Louis made a short sound that was not quite a laugh. "That sounds accurate to his opinion of me. He also said," Bessie continued, and something in her tone had shifted, become more careful, "that the man who held it had gotten it through a legal technicality, and that the real question of ownership had never been properly settled." The silence that followed that statement had a different quality than the ones before it. Louis sat forward very slowly, both forearms on the table, and looked at her with the full and undivided attention of a man who had learned to take threats seriously long before they became emergencies. "He said that to you," Louis said. "Yes. By name." "He mentioned my claim by name. He said the Hartwell claim," Bessie said steadily. "Yes." Louis sat back and pushed both hands through his hair, a gesture that would have told anyone watching him that this particular piece of information had hit somewhere that mattered. The legal dispute was long settled. The courts had ruled in his favor and the papers had been filed, and the stamps and seals were all where they needed to be. But settled disputes in the Colorado Territory had an unfortunate tendency to be unsettled by men with money and patience and lawyers in Denver. And if Colton was out there telling newcomers that Louis Hartwell's title was questionable, that was not idle gossip. That was preparation. That was groundwork. That was the beginning of something. "I am sorry," Bessie said quietly. "I do not know if that information is useful to you or only alarming, but it seemed important to tell you." Louis looked at her across the table. The alarm was real and the anger underneath it was real, but what surprised him, sitting in the lamplight of his own kitchen with a woman he had met an hour ago, was the faint, unfamiliar sensation of gratitude. She had not needed to tell him that. She could have stayed quiet and eaten her supper and been on her way in the morning without giving him anything but the basic facts of her presence on his property. "It is useful," he said. "Thank you," Bessie nodded once. And then, with the same unself-conscious practicality that had characterized everything she had done since he had found her on that rock, she picked up her coffee and finished it. He gave her the bunk in the back room that had been Daniel's, which was a thing he had not done for anyone since the morning he had found it empty, and he sat up for 2 more hours at the kitchen table with his deed and his survey papers spread out before him, thinking about Randall Colton and what was coming, and the strange intersection of this woman's journey with the ongoing war for his own ground. In the morning, Bessie Fairchild made breakfast. He woke to the smell of coffee and something frying, and he lay in his own bunk for a moment in the gray pre-dawn light, feeling disoriented by the ordinary domesticity of it, the sounds of another person moving in the kitchen of a cabin that had been silent for 3 years. He got up and dressed quickly and came through the door to find her standing at the iron stove in her traveling clothes, a cloth wrapped around her hand to hold the pan, and 2 tin plates already waiting on the table. She had found the salt pork and the eggs from the 2 hens he kept in a small coop behind the cabin, and she had made them into something that smelled considerably better than his own cooking ever managed. "I hope you do not mind," she said, turning when she heard him. "I am an early riser, and I thought it was the least I could do." Louis sat down at the table and looked at the plate she set before him with an expression that he was fairly certain communicated something he was not entirely comfortable communicating. "I do not mind," he said. They ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which surprised him. He was not, by any measure, a social man. The isolation of the claim had suited him in the years following Daniel's betrayal, had given him a kind of hard peace, a life stripped down to the essentials of work and weather, and the slow, satisfying accumulation of everything he had set out to build. He had not missed conversation particularly. He had not thought much about what it would feel like to share a table. But there was something about sitting across from Bessie Fairchild in the thin mountain morning light, watching her wrap both hands around her coffee cup against the early cold, that made the 3 years of solitude suddenly visible to him in a way they had not been before, like a piece of country you can only really see once you have come out of it. "What brought you from St. Louis?" he asked. The question came out with more genuine curiosity than he had intended. She looked up. There was a brief pause, not evasive but private, the pause of someone deciding how much of a true answer to give to a question asked in good faith by a near stranger. "My circumstances changed," she said finally. "My father died 2 years ago. He had debts I had not known about. There was very little left once they were settled, and the life I had expected to have in St. Louis was no longer available to me." She said it plainly, without bitterness, in the tone of someone who has had time to come to terms with a difficult fact. "I had been teaching privately, tutoring the children of several families. I had my certificate. When I saw the advertisement for the Glenwood School, it seemed like the right kind of chance." "A fresh start," Louis said. "Something like that." She looked at him steadily. "And you have the manner of a man who also came here looking for something specific." Louis was quiet for a moment. He was not accustomed to being read, or at least to having it acknowledged so directly. "Gold," he said simply, "like everyone else." "And did you find it?" "Some." He glanced toward the window, toward the claim outside, the rough ground and the mine shaft entrance and the machinery he had built and maintained with his own hands over 3 years of hard seasons. "Enough." "Enough for what?" she asked, and it was not a rude question. It was genuinely curious, the kind of question a person asks when they are actually interested in the answer. Louis thought about that for a moment longer than the question strictly required. "Enough to keep," he said at last. "Enough that it cannot easily be taken." Something in his tone must have reached her because her expression shifted, became gentler. "I think that matters more to you than the gold itself," she said. He looked at her sharply. But there was no calculation in her face, no probe, no attempt to find a weakness. She was simply saying what she saw, the way honest people did when they were paying real attention. "Yes," he said. And then, because it was the truth and she had earned at least that much by telling him about Colton, "Yes, it matters more." He walked her down to the main road that morning, taking the proper trail rather than the northern route she had come up the previous day. And the walk took nearly 2 hours through country that was, even he had to admit, genuinely beautiful in the October mountain light. The aspens were gold and orange, and the air had that particular Colorado clarity that made everything look closer and sharper than it was, and they walked mostly in silence. But it was the kind of silence that two people fall into naturally, when neither of them needs to fill every moment with words. At the place where the trail joined the main road into Glenwood, they stopped. Bessie held out her hand in the manner of a woman who has learned to make her own contracts with the world on her own terms. "Thank you, Mr. Hartwell," she said, "for the shelter and the walk. I am sorry to have caused you alarm." Louis took her hand. Her grip was firm and her palm was slightly calloused at the base of her fingers, the mark of a person who did real work. "You did not cause the alarm," he said. "Colton caused the alarm. You simply delivered the news." She smiled at that, and it was the first full smile he had seen from her. the kind that changed the whole quality of a face, and he felt the impact of it somewhere in the center of his chest in a way that he stood absolutely still against, the way you stood still against sudden cold or sudden heat, simply receiving it. "If you are in Glenwood," he said, before he had consciously decided to say it, "and you find yourself in further conversation with Randall Colton, I would be grateful to know anything he says about the Hartwell claim." Bessie looked at him with those steady, dark eyes. "You want me to listen for information. I want you to be careful," he said. "Colton is not a dangerous man in the direct way. He does not shoot people, he finds other methods. And a woman new to town, alone, with modest savings and a question about land," he stopped. "You would be useful to him." "I see." She did not seem offended by the bluntness of it. "And if I hear something worth knowing, how do I find you?" "Follow the main trail north out of town to the fork with the red survey marker. Take the right branch up the slope." "An hour's walking on the proper trail, not the northern route." He paused. "I will leave the latch off the cabin door if I am out on the claim." She nodded. She started down the road toward town, and then she turned back once, which he had not expected, and she said, "For what it is worth, Mr. Hartwell, the view from that rock was worth the walk, even under the circumstances." He watched her until she rounded the bend where the aspens closed the view, and then he stood for another moment in the sharp morning air before he turned and walked back up through the gold and orange trees toward his claim. His chest felt odd. He did not examine it too closely. 2 weeks passed. 14 days in which Louis worked the claim with the focused, methodical intensity that had characterized his entire adult life, hauling ore, crushing rock, panning the tailings, keeping his books in the battered ledger he had maintained since the first day he had driven his first stake. The work was his anchor and his rhythm and the proof of every morning that what he had was still his. He did not go into Glenwood. He told himself it was because he had no need of town, which was mostly true. He had provisions enough, and the claim required constant attention in the late season before winter closed the high passes. He told himself that several times, in the evenings when the cabin was quiet and the fire settled, and he found himself thinking about the quality of a particular silence and whether it was as comfortable as he had always believed it to be. On the 15th day, he saddled his horse and rode into Glenwood for supplies. The town had grown considerably since his first years in the territory. What had been a rough settlement of tents and frame shacks in the early part of the decade was now a legitimate small town with a proper main street, a hotel, a general merchandise store, a telegraph office, 2 saloons, a doctor's shingle, and the new school building that stood at the northern end of the street looking clean and deliberate among its older and rougher neighbors. Louis tied his horse outside the general store and went in for flour, coffee, and lamp oil, and he was loading his saddlebags at the back of the store when he heard the bell above the door jingle, and then a voice he recognized without having to think about it. Not Bessie's voice, a man's voice. Randall Colton's voice, with its particular cultivated flatness, the voice of a man who had come from somewhere and wanted you to know it. Louis stopped loading his saddlebags. "Miss Fairchild," Colton was saying, "what a fortunate coincidence. I was hoping to speak with you." Louis turned just enough to see them without being seen himself. Bessie was at the front counter with a small list in her hand, and Colton had positioned himself between her and the door in a way that was not quite blocking and not quite threatening, but was clearly deliberate. He was a well-dressed man, 50 or so, with gray at his temples and the careful, pleasant manner of a person who did all of his real work in offices and behind ledgers. "Mr. Colton," Bessie said, and her voice was perfectly polite and perfectly neutral. "What can I do for you?" "I wanted to follow up on our earlier conversation," Colton said, "about the land north of town. I understand you went up to have a look." A very brief pause. "I did go for a walk in that direction, yes." "And did you happen to encounter the claim I mentioned, the Hartwell claim?" "I may have crossed onto his land by accident," she said. "I was not certain of the boundaries." Colton made a sympathetic sound. "Those old surveys are terribly unclear. That is part of the difficulty with the Hartwell situation, you understand. The original staking was done under rather chaotic circumstances, and the legal questions remain, frankly, unresolved in any final sense. Louis's jaw was very tight. What legal questions? Bessie asked, in the tone of someone who is genuinely asking and not leading. Colton moved slightly, angling himself with the practiced ease of a man delivering a practiced speech. The claim was registered initially by two men. One of them, as I understand it, has since surrendered his interest in a manner that was not entirely unambiguous. My clients in Denver have some concern that the current sole occupant may not have fully clean title as a consequence. It was a lie. It was an artful, technically possible lie built on the genuine facts of Daniel's departure and constructed to sound like a legitimate legal uncertainty. Louis had heard versions of it before, in the court proceedings, in the depositions, in the careful letters from Colton's lawyers. But hearing it delivered to Bessie Fairchild in the back of the general store, delivered in that pleasant, reasonable tone as if it were simply a matter of record, made something flare hot in his chest. He stepped forward. Colton saw him coming, and to his credit his face did not change very much, only a slight tightening around the eyes that told Louis he had not expected to be overheard. Bessie turned, and there was a flash of something in her expression that was not relief exactly but was close to it, the expression of someone who had been holding a position alone and just received reinforcement. "Colton," Louis said, stopping 2 paces away. "Mr. Hartwell." Colton's tone remained pleasant. "What a surprise." "I imagine it is." Louis looked at him with a steadiness that had nothing warm in it. "I am going to say this once. My title to the Hartwell claim is registered, recorded, and legally established. The dispute was settled in the district court in 1876, and the ruling has not been and will not be overturned. If you continue telling people otherwise, I will consider it slander and I will respond accordingly." Colton spread his hands in a gesture of reasonable innocence. "I am merely discussing legal complexities as I understand them, Mr. Hartwell. That is not slander. That is conversation." "Then have your conversations carefully," Louis said. There was a moment of absolute stillness in the store. The shopkeeper behind the counter very busy with something behind him. The other 2 customers finding their boots extremely interesting. Colton nodded once pleasantly and moved toward the door, and then he stopped with his hand on the frame and he said, "You might want to check your survey markers on the eastern boundary, by the way. I have heard they have been disturbed." And then he walked out into the street. Louis stood very still for 3 full seconds. His eastern boundary markers, the flat granite rock, the place where he had found Bessie sitting. He turned to find her watching him. Her expression was composed, but her eyes were sharp and full of something active, the look of someone who has just seen a piece of a puzzle click into place. "He sent you up the northern trail to cross the eastern boundary," Louis said, low and level, "not to test whether I would drive you off, to see if I had noticed that the markers had been moved." Bessie was quiet for a beat. "If you had confronted me aggressively about being on your land, it would suggest you knew exactly where your boundaries were. If you had not," she paused, "if you had not even noticed, it would suggest the boundary had been in question long enough that I was no longer watching it." Louis pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose and breathed out hard. He moved the eastern markers, or had someone move them, and he wanted to know whether I had realized it. "Then you need to go back and check them," Bessie said simply. "Today." He looked at her. She was not afraid of the situation. She was not alarmed or fragile or waiting for him to manage the problem. She was standing in the general store with her shopping list in her hand, and she was looking at him with that clear, level gaze, and she was right. "Yes," he said, "I do." He paid for his supplies and loaded his horse, and he was tightening the saddlebag straps when Bessie came out of the store and stopped beside his horse. "I will come with you," she said. Louis turned and looked at her. "You have a school term starting." "Not for another 4 days." She met his eyes directly. "I know what the eastern boundary looked like when I was there. I can tell you if anything has changed." He stared at her for a long moment, something complicated moving in his chest, some resistance and some other thing entirely that was pushing against that resistance with quiet, steady pressure. "The walk is 2 hours," he said. "I know," she said. "I made it once already." They took the proper trail this time, the one that climbed the long way through the aspens and the spruce, and the October afternoon was cool and clear, and they walked side by side on the places where the trail was wide enough. Louis noticed things on that walk that he had not allowed himself to notice when he had walked her down to the road 2 weeks before, or had noticed and refused to look at directly. The way she moved on difficult ground, carefully but without complaint. The way she pointed out a hawk on a fence post without making a production of it. The way she asked a question, and then actually waited for the answer fully, without starting to form her next sentence while he was still finishing his response. He told her about Daniel, on a flat stretch above the tree line where the sky was enormous and blue, and the wind came in long cold sweeps off the high country. He had not told anyone the full account since the court proceedings, and he told it now in the flat, factual way that he had learned to tell it, without the anger and without the grief, just the sequence of events and the outcome. He told it expecting to feel nothing. He felt something, but it was different from what he expected. It was not the old jagged thing. It was something quieter and more complicated, the feeling of a wound that has been properly cleaned beginning to close, which was not comfortable but was different from infected, and that difference mattered. Bessie listened without interruption until he was done. Then she said, "He was your closest friend." "Yes." "That is the real damage," she said quietly. "Not the claim, the fact that it was him." Louis looked straight ahead up the trail and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that, because it was completely and precisely true, and he had never heard it stated that baldly before. They reached the eastern boundary in the late afternoon. The flat granite rock where he had found her was exactly as he had left it, and Bessie walked to it and stood on it, and looked around with the focused attention of someone trying to match memory to present reality. Louis was already moving along the boundary line, checking the stakes he had placed, the cairns of stacked stone that marked the survey corners, the blazed trees at the intervals where the line cut through timber. He found it 50 yards south of the granite rock. The corner cairn had been dismantled and rebuilt approximately 4 feet to the west, which would not be visible to a casual eye, but which moved the effective boundary of his claim inward by that margin all along its length. And if that margin was then used as the reference point for any subsequent survey or legal proceeding, his eastern boundary would be wrong, and the ground between the old line and the new one would be legally ambiguous. And legal ambiguity in the Colorado Territory in 1878 was a door that men like Randall Colton knew how to open. He stood at the rebuilt cairn with the cold wind coming off the high ridgeline and his hands steady and his chest very tight, and he thought about Colton's pleasant, reasonable manner, and the carefully delivered lie about legal complexity and the particular cruelty of an enemy who fights you with paperwork and patience rather than anything you can shoot back at. Bessie came and stood beside him. She looked at the cairn and then at him. "It has been moved," she said. It was not a question. 4 feet west, he said, along the entire eastern line probably. She was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Can you re-establish the original line?" "I have the original survey. I have the transit bearing. With the original documentation I can show exactly where this cairn should stand." He looked at the rebuilt stones with something cold and hard settling in him. "But I need to document this first, before I touch anything. Are there witnesses who knew the original boundary?" he thought. "My neighbor to the south, a man named Grover Perkins, helped me place these markers in the first year. He was present for the original staking." Bessie nodded. "Then you need Perkins to come and see this before it is corrected, and you should write down exactly what you found and when and who was present. A written account signed by witnesses." Louis looked at her. "You know something about legal documentation." Something moved across her face, private and complicated. "My father was an attorney," she said. "Before the debts, I grew up in a house full of papers and arguments about what constituted proper evidence." He stared at her for a moment against the falling light. This woman who had come up the mountain on the wrong trail and sat on his boundary rock, and turned out to know more about evidence law than half the men in the county, and he felt something happen in his chest that was too large to look at directly. "Then help me write it down," he said. They spent another hour at the boundary, with Louis using the compass from his kit to take fresh bearings and Bessie writing in the small notebook she had in her canvas bag, recording every measurement and observation in a careful, precise hand that he watched over her shoulder and thought was probably the clearest documentation he had ever seen produced in the field. They walked down in the early dark with a lantern, and the trail was just as treacherous as he had said it would be in the dark. And when the root crossing above the second switchback caught Bessie's foot and she stumbled, Louis caught her arm without thinking and held it, and neither of them moved for a moment that lasted exactly long enough for him to be fully and consciously aware of the fact that he was holding her arm and that he did not particularly want to stop. He let go. They kept walking. She stayed in the back room again that night. He did not make any ceremony of offering it, and she did not make any ceremony of accepting it. He made supper, a better effort than his usual, and they sat at the table with the notebook between them and went over what they had documented and what his next steps needed to be. It was practical and purposeful and entirely appropriate, and the whole time his pulse was doing something that was neither practical nor purposeful, something he had been ignoring with decreasing success for the past several hours. "What will you do about Colton?" she asked, looking up from the notebook. "Get Perkins to come up tomorrow and witness the displaced markers. Take both accounts to the county land office and file a formal complaint against any survey or boundary claim that differs from the original." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "And then wait. Colton's next move will be to produce a counter-survey. When he does, I will be ready." "He will not stop," Bessie said quietly. It was not pessimistic, just observational. "Men like that do not stop." "No," Louis agreed, "but they can be made to fail consistently enough that it becomes more expensive to continue than to walk away." Bessie looked at him with that steady, thoughtful look. "You are a determined man, Mr. Hartwell." "Stubborn," he said. "Colton told you that himself," the ghost of a smile. "He did. He meant it as a criticism. Most people do." "I do not," she said, and the directness of it, the simple, clear declaration, landed in the quiet kitchen and sat there with weight and warmth, and Louis found he had to look away from her for a moment, out at the dark window, while he reassembled his composure. In the morning she went back to town. He watched her down the trail this time, properly, all the way to the second bend, and she turned at the same place she had turned before. And this time he was already looking, so he caught the full weight of her smile, and he carried it with him up the mountain like something he had found and needed to figure out where to keep. Grover Perkins came up that afternoon, a weathered man of 55 who chewed tobacco and said little, but whose testimony in a legal proceeding was worth its weight in gold because the man was constitutionally incapable of exaggerating. He looked at the displaced cairn for a long time, chewing slowly, and then he spat and said, "That is not where that was." And Louis wrote it down, and Perkins signed the paper, and that was that. 2 days later, Louis rode into Glenwood to file his complaint at the land office. And the land office was attended by a young clerk named Peters, who was not Randall Colton, and who stamped everything Louis put in front of him with impersonal efficiency. And on his way out, Louis passed the new school building and stopped without planning to. Through the window, between the unpainted frames, he could see a woman standing at the front of a room full of children, writing something on a chalk board in that same clear, deliberate hand he had watched writing survey notes in the October wind. And the sight of it produced something in him that was unambiguous and warm, and made absolutely no logical sense, given that he had known this woman for fewer than 3 weeks. He rode home without going in. He thought about her for the entire 2-hour ride, which was not nothing, for a man who typically used those 2 hours to think about ore grades and winter preparation, and the state of his equipment. She came up to the claim on a Saturday, 12 days after the school term had started, and he knew she was coming before he heard her because his dog, an old shepherd mix named Flint who had been with him since the first year, went to the door and sat down and waited with the patient certainty of an animal who knew something Louis did not yet. She knocked, which she had not done the first time because the latch had been off as promised. He opened the door and she was standing there in a coat he had not seen before, a practical dark wool, and her hair was properly arranged for the first time in all the times he had seen her, and she was carrying a covered dish. "I made too much stew," she said. He looked at the covered dish. He looked at her face. He stepped back and held the door open without a word, and she came in, and the particular quality of warmth that filled the cabin when she walked in was something he recognized from the previous 2 visits, except that this time he did not pretend not to notice it. They ate the stew, and she told him about the school, about the 31 children who arrived the first morning ranging in age from 6 to 14, about the particular educational challenges of a room that contained every level of learning from basic alphabet to long division, and her face when she talked about it was fully alive in a way that he found himself reluctant to interrupt even when he had things to say. He told her about the complaint filing and the clerk and the anticipation of Colton's next move, and she listened with that attentive focus and said, "I spoke with a woman in town, a Mrs. Haverson, who has lived here for 6 years. She said Colton made the same attempt against a mining claim to the west of yours 3 years ago. A man named Grady. He was frightened off eventually." Louis was quiet. What frightened him off? Bessie looked at him. A series of small incidents, nothing that could be definitively attributed to anyone. Tools going missing. A section of flume destroyed in what looked like it might have been an accident. A rumor spread about the claim's productivity that made his backers withdraw. Louis turned that over carefully. Colton does not like to get his hands dirty. No, he prefers to create conditions. She paused. "Mr. Hartwell, Louis." It was the first time she had used his given name, and she did it with a slight hesitation, a conscious choice, and he felt it. "I think you should be careful this winter, alone up here. If Colton is escalating, I have been alone up here for 3 winters, he said. "I know." Her voice was even. "And Colton has apparently been working toward this for 2 years. The displaced boundary markers suggest he is moving into a more active phase." Louis looked at her across the table. The lamplight was warm and the stew was good, and the dog had his head in Bessie's lap, which was a thing Flint had never done with any visitor in 3 years of visitors, and Louis thought that the dog had considerably better instincts than his owner. "Are you asking me to be careful?" he said slowly. "Or are you asking me something else?" Bessie's hand stilled on the table. She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment he could see something resolving in her expression, some internal decision being made. "I am not sure I know exactly what I am asking," she said honestly. "I know that I have thought about this claim and the man who holds it considerably more than is warranted by 3 chance encounters. I know that I have found reasons to know things that might be useful to you. And I know that I walked up a mountain on a Saturday with a pot of stew, which I think speaks for itself." Louis said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I rode past the school 2 weeks ago. On my way out of town, I stopped to look through the window." Bessie looked at him steadily, waiting. "I did not go in," he said, "because I did not know what I would say." "And now?" she asked very quietly. Louis reached across the table, not far, just far enough, and his hand covered hers on the table with a deliberateness that was the most considered action he had taken in months, possibly years. "Now I think I have some ground to make up," he said. The smile that broke across her face was the kind that changed the weather of a room. They talked for 3 more hours that night, properly talked, the kind of talking that covered everything from the shallow surface down to the real depths of things, about her father and the life she had lost, and the courage it had taken to start again from nothing in a territory most people she knew considered barely civilized. About his boyhood in Ohio and the quality of his faith in Daniel before it broke, and what the breaking of it had done to his capacity for trust. about what each of them wanted from the lives they were building, and whether those things had any natural overlap. They had significant overlap. Neither of them pretended not to notice. He walked her down to the road in the dark with a lantern, which was different from all the previous times, because this time when they reached the place where the trail met the road, he did not immediately turn back up the mountain. They stood in the circle of lamplight with the Colorado night enormous and cold and brilliant above them, and he looked at her for a moment, this woman who had arrived on his boundary rock without knowing it was his and had proceeded to become steadily and irresistibly necessary to him. And then he said, "I will come to town on Thursday." "I will be at the school until 4, she said. "I will come at 4, he said. She walked toward town with the lantern because he insisted on it, and he walked up the mountain in the dark without one, knowing the trail well enough by feel and starlight, and the cold was considerable and the dark was total, and he felt more awake than he had felt in 3 years. Thursday came. He came at 4. He brought nothing particular, just himself, which felt like everything he had. They walked along the river road in the late afternoon light, and it was the first time they had walked somewhere without a destination or a purpose. Just walking, just talking, and Louis discovered that his capacity for this kind of ease was not entirely gone, only dormant, the way a field goes dormant in winter and comes back when the season changes. He came on Thursday the week after that, and the week after that, and by the third Thursday Glenwood was aware that Louis Hartwell was courting the new schoolteacher, which Louis was aware of and did not mind, and Bessie was aware of and also did not mind, in the serene and self-possessed way that characterized her relationship to other people's opinions. Randall Colton's countermove came in the second week of November, delivered in the form of a new survey filed at the county land office signed by a surveyor out of Denver named Matthias Wells, who claimed to have conducted a fresh boundary survey of the Hartwell claim and found the eastern boundary to fall 4 feet west of the position recorded in the original survey. It was, in other words, exactly the fabrication they had anticipated. A new survey that confirmed the displaced markers as the correct boundary. Louis rode into Glenwood in a controlled fury and went directly to the land office, where the clerk Peters seemed genuinely uncomfortable about the whole business, and Louis filed his objection with the original survey documentation and the sworn testimony of Grover Perkins and the field notes in Bessie's handwriting, and the copy of the court ruling from 1876 and everything else in the substantial folder he had been building since the day he first found the displaced cairn. He also sent a letter by telegraph to his lawyer in Denver, a man named Eustace Webb who had fought the original case, and who responded within 2 days with a letter that had considerably more legal weight than anything Colton could produce in the short term. And then, because there was nothing more to do on that particular front for the moment, he walked to the school and waited on the steps. When Bessie came out at 4 and found him there, she read his face immediately and said, "He filed." "Yes," Louis said, "I have responded. Webb is handling the Denver end." She sat down on the step beside him, which was not a thing a schoolteacher in a small town should necessarily do in the view of the whole street, and she did it anyway. "Is it going to be resolved in your favor?" "I believe so," he said. "Webb is good, and our documentation is better than theirs. But it will take time." "Yes," he looked at his hands, "several months, perhaps the spring." She was quiet beside him, and then she said, "Are you afraid?" The question was simple and unarmed, and Louis sat with it for a moment because it deserved a real answer. "I am afraid of losing what I built," he said. "Yes, I have been afraid of it for 3 years, but the fear has changed." "Changed how?" He looked at her at the side of her face in the late afternoon light, and he thought about how to say the thing that was true. "Before, the fear was about the claim itself," he said, "about the work and the money and what it represented. Now I am afraid of something larger, something that the claim is part of but not the whole of." Bessie turned to look at him. Her eyes were very direct and very warm, and she was waiting, the way she always waited, with the full quality of her attention. "I am afraid of losing the future I have started to be able to imagine," he said, "which I had not been able to do for a long time, until recently." The silence between them had the quality of something fully understood. She reached out and put her hand over his on the step, her fingers closing over his knuckles in the same deliberate way he had covered her hand at the table. And they sat like that while the late November light went golden and cold over the street of Glenwood, Colorado, and Louis Hartwell sat perfectly still and let himself feel it, all of it, without building anything around it to keep it out. He asked her to marry him on a December afternoon, up at the claim, standing in the snow on the flat granite rock where he had first found her. He had not planned to do it there specifically. He had been thinking about it for weeks, turning it over in the careful, methodical way he turned over every significant decision, examining it from every angle, asking himself whether he was being hasty, or whether hasty was even the right word for something that felt like the most considered choice he had ever made. He had ridden into town that Thursday with a ring in his coat pocket, a plain gold band he had bought from the jeweler on Main Street without excessive deliberation, because it was the kind of thing Bessie Fairchild would appreciate for its simplicity and its honesty. And then he had brought her up the mountain instead of walking the river road. And when they reached the flat rock with the valley spread white and gray below them in the December afternoon, something about it felt entirely right. He turned to her. She was looking out over the valley, her dark coat against the white rock, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. "This is where I found you," he said. She turned to look at him. "Yes." He took the ring out of his pocket. He held it in his palm, not offering it yet, just showing it the way you show a person something before you ask what they think of it. "I want to ask you something," he said. Bessie looked at the ring in his palm, her breath steadied. Her eyes came up to his face with the quality he had come to know as her fully present look, the one she gave the things that mattered most. "Louis," she said softly. "Marry me," he said, simple, direct. His voice did not waver. "I have been a closed man for a long time, and I know it, and I am asking you to believe that I am genuinely opening, not just trying to, actually opening. Because of you, and because of whatever this has been since the afternoon you sat on my rock and told me you had not known it was mine." Bessie looked at him for a long, full moment that felt like it had the weight of everything in it. "I knew something had changed the morning you made coffee without asking," she said. "Not for me. I made the breakfast. But you made the coffee without being asked and handed it to me before you sat down, and I thought, that is a man who has decided something, even if he has not said it yet." Louis smiled. It was a slow smile, one that took its time arriving, but when it came it changed his whole face in a way that probably matched what hers had done to him that very first day. "Is that a yes?" he said. "It is a yes," she said, and he put the ring on her finger right there on the cold granite rock with the valley below them and the sky enormous above them and the claim all around them, solid and established in his. And then he kissed her, which was the first time, and it was gentle and direct and absolutely unambiguous in its meaning. Flint, who had followed them up the trail at a discreet distance, chose this moment to trot forward and push his large gray head between them with the cheerful insistence of a dog who believed he was always welcome. And Bessie laughed against Louis's shoulder, and the laugh was warm and real and genuine, and it went all the way through him and settled somewhere near the center of him like something that had been loose and cold finally coming to rest. They were married in February. The ceremony was held in the Glenwood Church, a plain and practical building that matched both of them in character, and it was attended by Grover Perkins and his wife, several of Bessie's teaching colleagues, a handful of the mining families from the claims neighboring Louis, and approximately 12 of the older school children who had appointed themselves witnesses without being asked. The minister was a young man named Carlyle who had come to the territory with evident idealism and had developed a lean, practical faith that suited the country, and he performed the ceremony with warmth and without unnecessary length. Bessie wore a dress she had made herself, a deep blue-gray wool that suited the winter light coming through the church windows, and Louis wore his best coat, which Bessie had insisted on pressing the night before, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him, and felt the particular sensation of a man who has finally, after a great deal of difficulty, arrived exactly where he was always meant to be. The legal dispute resolved in April. Eustace Webb, Louis's Denver lawyer, had built an airtight case around the original survey documentation, Grover Perkins' testimony, Bessie's field notes, and several other pieces of evidence, including a statement from a former associate of Matthias Wells, the Denver surveyor who had signed Colton's fraudulent survey, who confirmed that Wells had been paid to falsify the boundary measurements. When this information was formally presented to the county land commissioner and copied to the district court, the counter-survey was voided, the displaced boundary cairn was officially discredited, and a notice of fraudulent filing was entered against Randall Colton and his Denver investors. Colton did not appear in Glenwood for several months after that. When he did return, he was quieter, his manner somewhat less smooth, and he did not look at Louis Hartwell directly when they passed on the street. Louis did not gloat. He was not, by nature, a man who gloated. He simply went on doing what he had always done, working the claim, maintaining the ground, paying his debts, building his life with the same patient, methodical attention he had brought to everything from the beginning. The difference now was that he did not come home to silence. Bessie moved up to the cabin after the wedding, which had required certain modifications to the structure that Louis had undertaken with a focused enthusiasm that revealed how thoroughly he had already been thinking about the practicalities of shared life. He built a proper bedroom partition, replaced the two small windows with larger ones that let in more of the mountain light that she loved, put in a second bookshelf for her considerable number of books, and constructed a covered porch along the south-facing side of the cabin where two chairs could sit side by side in the evening. She kept teaching. This had been a requirement she had stated plainly and early, and he had understood it immediately because he recognized in her relationship to her work the same thing that was true of his own relationship to the claim, the particular value of the thing you built yourself, and that was genuinely yours. She rode down to Glenwood 4 days a week, which was a 2-hour ride each way, and Louis had built a small stable in Glenwood near the school where her horse could stand during the day without charge, an arrangement he had made with the livery owner by means of a simple financial transaction and a look that discouraged negotiation. The school term ran through May, and in the early June evenings they sat on the south porch together and watched the light move across the valley below and talked about everything and nothing with the deep easiness of two people who have found their proper register with each other, the tone in which everything can be said. He told her, one June evening, about the specific moment he had known. On the walk down to the road, he said, the first morning. You had been here one night and you had eaten my breakfast and told me something about Colton that you did not have to tell me, and as we were walking, you pointed out a hawk on a post. Bessie was quiet, listening. You pointed at it, he said, and then you did not say anything. You just pointed and I looked and we both saw it and then we kept walking, and I thought he paused, looking out at the valley. I thought that was the most natural thing that had happened to me in 3 years. Bessie was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I knew on the rock the very first night. He turned to look at her. You knew what on the rock? That you were not going to shoot me, she said. And not because you had made a judgment about me, but because of the way you looked when you found me. You were furious and suspicious and you had the rifle up, and then I turned around and you were, she shook her head slightly. You were just looking, just really looking, and I thought this is not a man who operates from fear. He operates from something more considered than that. Louis looked at her. You concluded that from one look. I concluded that from one look, she confirmed, with the serene certainty of someone who had long since made peace with the reliability of their own perceptions. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had come to do in the evenings, their two hands on the armrest between the chairs, A simple and complete thing. In late August, Bessie told him she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen, early in the morning, before either of them had spoken much, which was the hour when she tended to say the things she had been thinking about at night. She said it plainly and directly, the way she said everything, watching his face. Louis set down the coffee cup. He looked at her across the kitchen table for a long moment. Something moved through him that was so large and so complete that he was not certain he had adequate words for it. He got up and came around the table and put both arms around her in the careful, full way of a man who has spent too much of his life keeping his hands to himself and has been learning to stop. She put her head against his shoulder, and he held her in the kitchen with the morning coming through the windows and the claim outside beginning its long summer day, and neither of them said anything for a considerable time, because there was nothing to say that was more true than the fact of standing there together. The baby came in the spring, in April, which made him an April child on a Colorado mountain claim, which Louis thought was a good kind of origin story. He was born early on a Thursday morning, which had always been their day, and he was healthy and loud, and had his father's dark brows and his mother's direct, evaluating gaze, which was present from the very first week in a way that made Louis laugh out loud the first time he properly noticed it. They named him James Daniel Hartwell. The Daniel was a quiet decision that Louis made without explaining it at length, and Bessie understood it without requiring explanation, understood that it was his way of releasing something rather than honoring it, of taking a name that had been attached to betrayal and returning it to the neutral world, making it clean. James was a healthy and determined child who crawled at 6 months and stood at 9, and was walking by the time his first birthday came around, which resulted in a period of extraordinary vigilance on the part of both parents, because the cabin was on a mountain claim, and there were any number of places a fast and fearless small person should not be allowed to arrive unaccompanied. Louis built a fence. He built it with the same care he had built everything, and Bessie watched him from the porch on the Sunday afternoon. He did the last section, James on her hip watching too with his serious evaluating eyes, and she thought about the man she had first seen across 50 yards of mountain shale with a rifle raised, and how thoroughly she had underestimated the depth of him, even as she had understood something essential from the start. She put James down on the porch floor and let him investigate the boards while she watched Louis come back across the yard, pulling off his work gloves, and she said, "It is a very good fence." He looked up at her and smiled, that slow smile that had been coming more easily with every passing month, the one that was worth the wait. "It will do," he said. By the time James was 2, the mine had produced enough in the previous 3 seasons to entirely clear Louis's remaining debts from the legal battles and to begin generating real surplus, which he handled with the same careful, methodical approach that characterized every aspect of his relationship to the land. He did not become extravagant. He became secure, which was the thing he had always been working toward, the state in which what you have built cannot be easily taken, and the particular comfort of arriving at that state was different from and deeper than the straightforward pleasure of having money. He expanded the cabin in the fall, adding a proper bedroom for James and a room that Bessie claimed for her books and her reading and her school preparation work, a space that was hers in the particular way that mattered to a woman who had come to this country with nothing and built herself a life on her own terms. Randall Colton attempted one more legal maneuver in the fall of 1880, a challenge filed through a different set of Denver lawyers claiming an easement across the northern edge of the Hartwell claim. Webb demolished it in 2 months and the challenge was dismissed. After that, Colton apparently redirected his attentions to other properties, other targets, other schemes. Louis heard about him occasionally through the particular information network of small-town Western life, always working some angle somewhere, always doing it pleasantly and reasonably, and at a remove from anything that could be directly proved. It did not worry Louis in the way it once had. The claim was solid, The title was clear, the documentation was thorough and maintained, and Louis had long since learned that you could not spend your life watching for the enemy at the expense of living the life you were defending. He had Bessie for that philosophy. She had stated it to him, more precisely, on an evening in the second year of their marriage when he had been worrying aloud about Colton, and she had said, with the patient clarity that she brought to everything important, "He wants you to spend more energy on him than he is worth." That is his actual strategy. Every hour you think about him is an hour he wins without doing a single thing. Louis had been quiet for a moment, and then he had said, "That is possibly the most useful thing anyone has ever said to me about this situation." "Good," she had said. "Remember it." He did. James was 3 when Bessie told him there would be a second child. She told him in the morning again, in the kitchen, though this time she did it by simply putting his hand flat against her middle and looking at him with that warm, direct gaze, and Louis understood immediately and laughed, which surprised her and delighted her in equal measure, because laughing in response to good news was not something he had done in the early part of their acquaintance, and the growth of it was something she had watched with a steady, private gratitude. The second child was a girl, born in the winter in December, and she arrived with considerably more speed and efficiency than James had, and immediately established herself as a person of strong and specific preferences, which were evident from the first days in the nature of her protests and her satisfactions, and the exact quality of her displeasure when things did not meet her requirements. They named her Clara Rose Hartwell, the Rose after Bessie's mother, who had died when Bessie was 17, and Bessie sat in the wide chair by the window on the day they decided on the name, and looked at the baby in her arms and said the name quietly, testing it, and Louis watched her face while she did it, and felt the particular depth of what it was to share the significant things of a life with someone who was genuinely, completely your person. James regarded his sister with the wary professional attention of a small person who has had exclusive occupancy of a territory and is uncertain about the new development. He came around within 2 weeks, at which point he became so determinedly protective that the actual difficulty was preventing him from carrying her around without supervision, which he was considerably too small to do safely despite his confidence about it. Louis took James to the mine for the first time when the boy was 4. It was a brief and carefully managed visit, just to the entrance of the main shaft, and James stood at the mouth of it with enormous gravity and looked into the dark, and then looked at his father and said, in the precise and considered way that he had already developed, which was startlingly like his mother's manner of speaking, "Is this where the gold comes from?" "Yes," Louis said. James looked back into the shaft. "I want to see." "When you are older," Louis said, "when you can carry a lamp." James considered this. "How much older? A few years yet." James looked at his father with a measuring look that was so thoroughly Bessie's expression transposed onto a small face that Louis had to work to hold his own expression steady. "That is a long time," James said. "Yes," Louis agreed. "It is, but it will come." He walked the boy back to the cabin in the afternoon light, James's small hand in his large one, and he thought about time and the passing of it, and what it meant to have built something on a piece of Colorado mountain ground that was solid and true, and was not going anywhere. He thought about the afternoon 3 years before the marriage when he had crossed 50 yards of shale with a raised rifle, and a heart full of 3 years of hardened suspicion, intending to drive off whoever was trespassing on his land. He thought about the way she had turned around, the way her face had held no calculation, the way she had said those simple words, "I had not known it was yours." He had not known, then, what those 5 words were going to become. He had not known that they were the beginning of the only story that would ever matter as much as the one he had spent 3 hard years building alone. The evening after the first trip to the mine, with James asleep and Clara settled, and the cabin quiet in the particular good way it was quiet when everyone you loved was in it, Louis sat on the south porch in the September dark and looked out over the valley below, and Bessie came and sat in the chair beside him with 2 cups of coffee and the old, comfortable ease of people who know each other all the way down. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Louis took the coffee and was quiet for a moment, just looking at the valley and the dark shapes of the hills and the enormous clear sky above the Colorado night. "The day I found you," he said. Bessie was quiet. "I had the rifle up," he said. "I was thinking about Colton and the claim and the 3 years of having to fight for what was mine, and I came across that shale and I was ready for anything except what I found." "What did you find?" she asked softly. "A woman sitting on a rock looking at my valley," he said, like she was already a part of it. Bessie set down her cup. She looked at him in the dark. "I felt it too," she said quietly. "Even through the rifle and the suspicion and the whole alarming beginning of it. I felt the valley and the ground and the particular quality of the light, and I thought, this is a place where something real has been built. And then I turned around and found the man who built it." Louis set down his own cup. He reached across the armrest and his hand covered hers, their fingers knitting together in the way they had settled into over years of evenings on this porch. "I am glad you sat down," he said. Bessie laughed soft and warm. "I was tired," she said. "My feet hurt and the view was remarkable. I had no idea I was sitting on your life." "You were," he said, "even before you knew it. You were already sitting right in the middle of it." The night was clear and cold, and the stars over the Colorado mountain were the kind of stars that exist only at high elevation, and in the particular darkness that comes from being far from the centers of things, dense and close and almost unnervingly bright. Below them, the valley was a long blue darkness with the river a paler gray thread through it, and above them, the high ridgeline cut a clean black line against the sky. It was everything he had come here for. It was everything, and it was more. In the years that followed, the claim gave Louis what he had always hoped it would give him. Not enormous wealth, not the kind of money that changes a person into something they were not, but the solid, reliable sufficiency of a thing well made and carefully tended. He worked it through the seasons and maintained it through the decades and taught James its rhythms when the boy was old enough to work beside him. And James was good at it, had the same patient, methodical attention to the ground that Louis had brought from the beginning. Bessie taught at the Glenwood School for 12 years before the town grew large enough to require 2 teachers, at which point she became the senior teacher and trained the second one with the same focused, exacting care she brought to everything. She was known throughout the county as the best teacher in the region, not because anyone made a formal pronouncement to that effect, but because it was simply true, and everyone who had any connection to the school in those years knew it without needing to say it. Clara grew up to be a person of such precise and specific intelligence that Louis sometimes simply watched her with the wondering attention of a man who cannot quite believe the things that have been given to him. She had opinions about everything, expressed them clearly, and was not in any way uncertain about her own perceptions, which Louis found both familiar and deeply satisfying. She became a doctor eventually, which was not a common thing in 1900 for a woman, but which was, for anyone who had known Clara Hartwell from the beginning, entirely predictable. The third child came when Louis was 38 and Bessie was 36, which surprised both of them and delighted both of them in the way that unexpected gifts do when they arrive late, and you did not know until they came that you had been missing them. This one was a boy, born in July, who had his father's dark eyes and his mother's way of going absolutely still when something interested him, which was Louis's favorite quality in any human being. They named him Thomas August Hartwell, and he was the summer child of the family, easy-natured and warm and genuinely curious about every person he met, which made him, in some ways, the member of the family most unlike either of his parents, and which they loved him for enormously. Grover Perkins died in 1886, and Louis went to the funeral and stood at the grave and thought about the afternoon 3 years into his isolation, when Perkins had simply showed up at his fence line and said, without preliminary, "Your flume section is losing water. thought you should know. And that had been the beginning of the only real friendship Louis had managed during those years. A friendship built entirely on practical information and absolute reliability, and the shared understanding of two men who believed that showing up was more valuable than saying you would. He had been a good neighbor and an honest witness and a decent man in a territory that did not always produce them in sufficient numbers, and Louis missed him with the specific, clean grief of someone who has lost a thing whose value he understood while he had it. Randall Colton died in 1889 in Denver, apparently of natural causes. Louis heard about it from a man at the assay office and received the information without particular feeling in either direction. He thought about it briefly that evening, and then he thought about the way the light had been on the eastern slope that afternoon, and the state of the ore seam in the north drift, and whether James was ready to begin learning the transit and the survey tools, and that was the proportion of his attention that Colton deserved. None more, none less. On the 25th anniversary of their marriage, which fell on a February Thursday that was cold and clear and blue in the particular brilliant way of Colorado winters, Louis saddled both horses and rode with Bessie up the trail to the flat granite rock on the eastern boundary. They had not been up here together since the December afternoon he had proposed. The claim was older now, more thoroughly worked, the mine shafts deeper and the equipment more sophisticated, and the infrastructure of a producing operation more fully developed across the ground around the cabin. But the eastern boundary was unchanged, the same survey line through the same spruce timber and the same granite exposure, and the flat rock still stood at the edge of the high ground with the valley below it laid out in its winter whites and grays. They got down from their horses and stood on the rock side by side, looking out. The valley was enormous and still, and the air was cold enough that their breath came in long white clouds, and the horses shifted behind them with the small sounds of animals who would prefer to be moving. "What does it look like to you now?" Louis asked. Bessie stood beside him with her coat collar up against the wind and her dark eyes scanning the valley with that quiet attention. "Like hours," she said. Louis looked at her. She turned to face him with the smile that had not diminished in 25 years, the one that changed the whole quality of the air around it, and she said, "The first time I sat here, I thought it was the most beautiful piece of ground I had ever seen. I thought that with no knowledge of whose it was. And then you came across that rock with your rifle and your suspicion and your 3 years of reasons not to trust anyone, and you were so clearly a man who had built every inch of this with his own hands and his own will." She shook her head slightly. "I think I knew even then, even before the coffee." "Before the hawk," he said. "Before the hawk," she agreed. He put his arm around her on the flat granite rock, standing on the eastern boundary of his claim on their anniversary, and she leaned into his side with the complete, uncalculated ease of 25 years, and they stood there for a long time in the February cold, looking out over the valley that was theirs together, that was more fully his now than it had ever been when he had held it alone. Because the truth he had learned over 25 years of loving Bessie Fairchild Hartwell was that the things you build by yourself are solid, and the things you build with the right person are something more than solid. They are home. The mine gave out eventually, as mines do. By 1895, the main seam had thinned to the point where working it was no longer profitable, and Louis made the decision with the same calm practicality he had brought to every major decision since the first day he had driven the first stake. He closed the mine in the orderly manner of a man who has always taken care of his tools, sealed the shafts properly, secured the equipment, filed the necessary paperwork, and turned his attention to the remaining timber on the claim, which was substantial and represented a different kind of wealth that he worked carefully and selectively over the following years. He missed the mine. He would have been dishonest to say otherwise, and he was not, constitutionally, a dishonest man. He missed the weight of the work and the specific satisfaction of the ore, and the deep particularity of a task he had learned from the ground up with his own hands. But the claim was still his, and the ground was still solid under his feet, and the cabin stood on the slope with its south porch and its wide windows and its 3 bookshelves, and the particular warmth that a house accumulates over 20 years of being genuinely lived in. And that was not nothing. That was, in every way that counted, everything. James married a woman named Adeline Price in 1901, and they settled on the adjacent claim that Grover Perkins' son had sold when he decided to try his luck in the newly opened country to the west. Adeline was a forthright woman from a Colorado farming family who regarded the Hartwell clan with equal parts warmth and frank amusement, and she fit into the family with the ease of someone who has found her people without particularly having to search. She and Bessie talked for hours in the kitchen and on the porch and across the fence between the 2 properties, and watching this from the middle distance, Louis felt something that he recognized after a moment as the deepest form of contentment, the kind that is not about individual happiness, but about the whole fabric of things being properly made and well maintained. James and Adeline had their first child, a boy, in 1903, which made Louis Hartwell a grandfather on a Colorado mountain claim on a Tuesday in June, and he sat on the south porch that evening with the brand-new knowledge of it and the valley below him in the long summer light, and thought about the year 1875, when he had come to this country with $200 and a mule and a faith in another person that had not yet been tested, and the year 1878, when everything he had built had been at genuine risk, and the morning had changed direction entirely on a flat granite rock at the edge of his eastern boundary. He thought about what it meant that a thing had ended in something like this. In the sound of Bessie's voice in the kitchen through the open window, in the fact of James and Adeline 200 yards over the fence, in a grandchild with his grandfather's dark eyes already. It meant that the building had been good, not perfect, not without cost or loss or the specific permanent damage of the things that betrayal does to a person's capacity for trust. But good, in the real sense of the word, the sense in which good means made from true materials and maintained with honest care and large enough, ultimately, to hold everything that needed to be held. Louis Hartwell sat on his south porch in the June evening of 1903, and watched the Colorado light move across the valley below his claim, and he was at rest. Not the rest of a man who has stopped, but the rest of a man who has finished the work that needed doing, or at least brought it to a place where it can continue without him carrying every piece of it alone. Bessie came out with 2 cups of coffee, the same as she always had, the same as she had since the first October morning when she had made breakfast in his kitchen without being asked, and handed him coffee before she sat down. She sat in the chair beside him. He took the coffee. Their hands found each other on the armrest between the chairs, fingers knitting together in the familiar, necessary way, and the evening settled over the valley below them, and the aspens along the eastern slope caught the last of the light and went gold, the way they always went gold in the long Colorado evenings, and Louis Hartwell held his wife's hand on the porch of the home they had built together and was, in the fullest and most honest sense of the word, grateful. Not for the gold, though the gold had mattered. Not for the legal victories, though the victories had been necessary. Not even entirely for the claim itself, though the claim was the ground on which everything else stood. Grateful for the particular afternoon in October of 1878 when a woman had sat down on his boundary rock without knowing it was his, and had turned around when he came across the shale, and had looked at him with those dark, steady eyes and said 5 words that had turned out to be the beginning of an entire life. I had not known it was yours. No, she had not known. And neither had he, not then, not standing there with the rifle and the suspicion, and the 3 years of careful, necessary solitude between him and the possibility of letting anyone in. He had not known that she was going to be his too, but she was. She had been from that first moment, in the way that the true things are always true before they are known, waiting in the ground like gold, patient, solid and entirely real.